Egyptian Kings from Heaven. There is a document known as the Turin King List. It's an extremely old piece of papyrus from about 3,000 years ago, created by scribes during the reign of Ramses II. The list is filled chronologically with the names of Egyptian rulers. In fact, it is the most extensive list from ancient Egypt that details the kings and overlords of the great nation. However, the beginning of the list was never found, and neither was the end of it, and so it's not totally complete. Scholars have been able to learn a lot of information from the list. It details the names of the rulers, how long they were in power, including months and days, and even which rulers were connected by family. It's basically a cheat sheet going back thousands of years for the entire history of the ruling class in Egypt. But there's something very mysterious about the Turin King List, and one major problem. Not only does it name rulers going back to the 15th dynasty, but it also lists mythical kings and gods. Mixed in with the names of the normal human kings are legendary beings that supposedly ruled Egypt, creatures that came down from the sky to take over the country. Many of these are listed as having ruled the kingdom before the days of the pharaohs. Obviously, there's a bit of confusion here. If the list is to be believed, Egypt was dominated by god kings who ruled over a mythical time in Egypt's history, before the days of the pharaohs. Either Egypt really was first ruled by godly beings from the sky, or the Egyptians just believed that such a time existed, in what they thought of as their ancient past. The Merovingians. The Merovingian dynasty was a family of Frankish kings who ruled over Dark Age Europe in the 5th century. They were also known as the long-haired kings, because of the tradition they had of keeping their hair long and flowing like romance novel heroes or elven kings. Or, like Legolas in Lord of the Rings. Anyway, I digress. If you've never heard of the Merovingians, you aren't alone. Though they played a major role in reshaping Europe after the collapse of the Roman Empire, they disappeared after 250 years, when they were usurped by the Carolingian dynasty, whose most famous ruler was Charlemagne. But the small role of the Merovingians in global history isn't the only reason you haven't heard of them. There are some rumors that powerful forces out there, including the Vatican, would prefer you never heard of these people. This is because they identified themselves as the direct descendants of Jesus Christ. According to the Merovingians, they were the rightful kings of the world. They believed that Jesus Christ escaped his crucifixion and fled to what is now modern France, previously the Kingdom of Francia. But he didn't escape alone. He went on the run with Mary Magdalene. The two settled there, had children, and those descendants allegedly went on to become the powerful Merovingian kings. We, of course, have no proof that this is true. We do have historical records of the various Frankish kings who apparently shared the blood of Jesus in their veins. But 1,500 years later, it's impossible for anyone to truly know the bloodline of the ancient kings. What do you think of this controversial claim? Too close to the Da Vinci Code, or do you think it's possible? The Vimana. The Vimana is a powerful flying machine described in Sanskrit texts from ancient India. We can find mention of the Vimana in all kinds of these ancient writings, from the Ramayana to the Yajurveda. It's almost always described as the same thing. It was an enormous temple or a palace which could fly through the sky like a floating city. Not only could the Vimana travel through the atmosphere, but they could also fly to space and dive underwater. Imagine the biggest temple you can think of, but it can launch itself into space to visit other planets. Weirdly enough, legends of the Vimana gave specific details about how the mysterious thing achieved its flight. It was described as having at least 2 engines, although no one can explain how the ancients even knew what an engine was. The flying fortress was also said to have deadly weapons, things that could wipe out entire civilizations. They could be used for ordinary travel to get from one place to another, or for warfare. Scientifically, there is no evidence that the Vimana was real. Archaeologists have never found any proof that flying machines soared above the skies of India, but that doesn't mean one didn't exist. Judging by how many stories of flying machines there are in ancient Indian texts, the idea came from somewhere, maybe somebody or something, which was mistaken for a god by the original inhabitants of India, visited using an advanced spaceship. But because the locals understood nothing about space travel, they just described it as a flying temple. What do you think? Just ancient mythology or something else? Let me know in the comments below. The alien gods of Egypt. Aliens have invaded ancient history wherever you go. Ancient Egypt as we think of it began about 5,000 years ago, and it is hard for many to believe that people were so advanced during that time. At ancient sites, archaeologists have found ramp systems, post holes, and inscriptions detailing how the ancient pharaohs built their impressive structures. Ancient Egypt was one of the most advanced societies on the planet, but how did they move such heavy blocks such long distances? And why did they worship such strange gods? The more exciting fringe theory is that it was because they had help from aliens. Since the late 19th century, this theory has gained traction when science fiction authors started including it in their work. Every ancient society worshipped some kind of pantheon of mysterious gods, from the Assyrians worshipping the Anunnaki to the Greeks worshipping the gods of Mount Olympus. But the Egyptian deities were slightly more extraterrestrial than the others. The show Ancient Aliens has greatly helped make this theory more popular. As Rice Thomas pointed out in a Vice article, when the mystery is as big as the Great Pyramid of Giza, which has been around for thousands of years and is still standing, it's easy to see why. There is also the case of the famous pharaoh Akhenaten from the 14th century BC. He is depicted with large eyes, an enormous cone skull, skinny arms and legs, and an odd protruding tummy. His appearance has made many question if he actually was an alien. It appears as though Pharaoh Akhenaten had a genetic mutation which caused his brain to grow far larger than normal, and for some strange reason, he got rid of all the Egyptian gods and declared there was only one. Many other pharaohs and members of the royal family appear to have long, elongated skulls and large eyes, probably from cranial deformation, but to some, they are proof of visitors from another world. The first exorcism. In France during the 1590s, there was a young woman by the name of Martha Brassiere. She became a pretty well-known celebrity because it was widely believed she was possessed by demons. But it wasn't only her possession that made her famous. It was the fact that her parents took her on tour. They went from town to town and put on a show, with Martha Brassiere and the demon inside of her drawing packed crowds of spectators. According to the old reports, the girl's eyes would roll back in her head, she would flick her tongue out like a snake, and convulse while growling in a deep and demonic voice. This was so outrageous that even King Henry IV got himself involved. He decided the girl needed to be cured of the demon inside her, and so he ordered what became the first scientifically controlled exorcism. A group of high priests gathered around the girl, placed a piece of wood in her mouth to keep her from swallowing her tongue, sprinkled her with holy water, and recited holy scripture while the demon inside of her screamed in misery. But what Martha didn't realize was that the exorcism was fake. It was just normal water she was being sprinkled with, and the holy scripture was just Latin poetry. The whole thing was a scientific experiment, something set up by the king himself to expose Martha and her family as the fraud. The dark history of Valentine's Day. Love it or hate it, Valentine's Day is widely regarded as the most romantic day of the year. But the history behind this candy and romance-fueled greeting card holiday is dark and foreboding. Although nobody has been able to pinpoint the exact origin of Valentine's Day, the very first time it was ever celebrated, we do know where it started. From February 13th to February 15th, ancient Romans celebrated Lupercalia. It wasn't celebrated with giving chocolates to your partner or going to a romantic dinner. That is the much more recent Victorian interpretation. No, in ancient Rome, it was a pagan holiday fueled by fires, passion, violence, and animal sacrifice. It started with the sacrifice of goats and a dog in honor of the wolf mother who nursed Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome. There were special priests who organized this festival known as the Luperci, who would dip their knives in blood and cut the skin off the animals, then go about hitting women who wanted to have children, as it was believed that by the skin touching them during this festival, they would become more fertile. According to religious studies professor Noel Lenski, the Romans were a bunch of depraved, intoxicated maniacs. But the fun didn't stop there. They also practiced a matchmaking lottery, where the men pulled names of women from a vessel. These couples would be matched up, regardless of if they wanted to or not, for the duration of the festival. The name Valentine comes from the execution of a priest on February 14th in the 3rd century. This man was honored by the Catholic Church as a martyr, but there were several other Christian martyrs also called Valentine. In the 5th century, when the Roman Empire was Christian, a pope ordered the festival of Lupercalia to be banned, and instead would be honored in a more somber, orderly way under the name of Saint Valentine's Day. The stone monuments of Nuku Hiva. The stone monuments of Nuku Hiva are quite strange. For those unfamiliar with this place, Nuku Hiva is a large French Polynesian island in the Pacific Ocean. It's famous for the stone monuments scattered across its beautiful and isolated landscape. Most of the stone monuments are at a small settlement called Temehea Toua. Archaeologists say they were created between the 11th and 14th centuries, and that every statue is a depiction of one of the ancient deities of Nuku Hiva. And although these deities are ancient, some are still being worshipped today. What we know is that the original inhabitants of this tropical island arrived several thousand years ago, and although their culture has changed since then, their origin story has remained more or less the same. According to the people of Nuku Hiva, the god of creation is Ono. He created the Polynesian islands as a gift to his wife, taking the earth and turning it into a giant palace. But that palace eventually decayed, and the islands are what remains of its walls and roof. Another interesting thing about these people is that there were once way too many of them. The island itself had about 100,000 people. This made it almost impossible for communities to live and eat. They had food shortages, there weren't enough fish, and supposedly the people of the island resorted to organized cannibalism. Under the trees of Nuku Hiva and beyond, the tropical coastline has a secret history of blood and death. The Index Librorum Prohibitorum. The Catholic Church's history of censorship dates at least as far back as the 9th century. Still, one of its more extreme attempts to control its followers came with the publishing of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1560. Established by Pope Paul IV, it was essentially a list of thousands of books and publications that Catholic worshippers were banned from reading. Perhaps the most dramatic form of censorship in Christendom, the Index was not limited to theology. It banned works ranging from love stories to philosophical treatises to political theory. The Index prohibited both religious and secular works, as well as versions of the Bible that the Church had not approved. Many were written by intellectuals and were about topics like astronomy and philosophy. The invention of the printing press had made reading material far more accessible than ever before, and Catholic authorities saw this type of thought-provoking and scholarly material as a threat to its followers' faith. Pope Paul IV created the Index partially as a response to this increased availability of literature, which officials believed might encourage people to question or stop believing what the Church told them. 20 subsequent editions were issued over the next several hundred years, with the final version being published in 1948. It was only enforceable within the Papal States and in places where civil governments adopted it, which happened in several Italian states. The Catholic Church formally abolished the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1966. Instead of replacing it, officials left it up to each individual to discern what types of material are dangerous to their spiritual well-being. In announcing these changes, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith reminded followers that they have a responsibility to use sound moral judgment in making these decisions and avoiding anything that might poison their faith. The Knights Templar and Friday the 13th. If you ever wondered why Friday the 13th is such a terrifying day, it actually goes back thousands and thousands of years. In fact, there is a hidden truth behind the Friday the 13th phenomenon that has to do with an ancient legal document, the Sumerians, and the Knights Templar. One theory is that the Code of Hammurabi, which is considered to be the oldest legal document in the world, superstitiously omitted the 13th rule from its list, starting the trend over 2,000 years before today. Others say the paranoia around the 13th comes from the Sumerians, who thought the number 12 was perfect and the number 13 was evil. But by far the most interesting theory, perhaps, has to do with the Knights Templar and their destruction. It was in 1118 that they began life as a monastic military order. Their first task was to protect pilgrims who traveled to the Holy Land, but they quickly became one of the most influential groups of the Middle Ages. They grew very rich after the Crusades and had their own castles, churches, and established their own banks. Their downfall came early in the morning on Friday, October 13th, 1307. Around 600 Templars were arrested. They were charged with heresy and devil worship. Pretty much all of them were brutally tortured or burned by medieval inquisitors. It is said that the very date of the destruction of the Knights Templar has stuck in human memory ever since, transformed into the evilest day on the calendar. The Vatican mythographers. The Vatican mythographers are a group of unknown authors responsible for writing a small collection of medieval texts. These unknown people, with ties directly to the Vatican, wrote down Latin translations of all the Greek and Roman myths they could find. All of these texts were then put into a single medieval manuscript, which was published later on in 1831 by Cardinal Angelo Mai. The thing about these translations is that they very well may have shaped our modern understanding of mythology, specifically that of ancient Greece and Rome. As you may already know, most fairy tales, stories like Cinderella and Hansel and Gretel, are actually pretty horrifying in their original forms. These were tales of caution from hundreds of years ago, told to children to keep them well behaved. And in the same way, the ancient Greek myths were altered into Christian fairy tales by the Vatican mythographers. They took the original stories and rewrote them to fit their own Christian purposes. Not everything in the stories was changed, but when these manuscripts were written in the 12th century, roughly 234 myths were retold through the Christian lens. Everything we know about gods like Zeus and Hades, and the legends of those like Medusa and Perseus, it's all a byproduct of the Vatican mythographers. The Roman financial crisis. When most of us think about ancient Rome, we think of wealth, powerful armies, and an undying legacy. But there is a less talked about, more forbidden part of Roman history that may just be a warning for our own grim future. Historian Charles Bartlett recently compared something that happened in Rome 2,000 years ago to the economic crisis of 2008. In the year 33 AD, the Roman Empire plunged into economic chaos. This happened when rulers passed a law that required creditors to invest part of their capital in Italian lands. The money was used to help with agriculture, create more beautiful pieces of architecture, and solidify the foundation of Rome. Everyone was supposed to be a winner. But what happened is that creditors rushed to buy as much land as they could. It created a credit crunch. The Roman Emperor Tiberius had to free up vast sums of money for interest-free loans to stop the crisis from getting any worse. In simple terms, land became suddenly valuable in Italy. Those with the credit to purchase the land did it as quickly as they could. But to do it, they had to call in all their debts. Debtors then went broke. They purchased too much land and prices dropped. There was a desperate buy and sell spree, credit was non-existent, and the land value plummeted as interest rates were driven up sharply. It was a mess, almost like what happened in 2008. What many people don't realize is that the same thing that happened in the modern world already happened in the Roman world, and we all know how that ended. Poveglia. In northern Italy's Venetian lagoon, less than a half-mile from Venice, the tiny island of Poveglia first appeared on the historical record during the 5th century. It remained inhabited until 1379, when its residents fled because of warfare. Starting in 1776, Poveglia was used as a quarantine station for plague victims and sufferers of other diseases before being converted into a mental hospital in 1922. The island has been vacant since the asylum closed in 1968, despite recent efforts to repurpose it into a luxury vacation resort. As much as half of Poveglia's soil contains human remains left behind by the over 160,000 patients who died there. Archaeologists have uncovered mass graves containing the remains of hundreds of plague victims on nearby islands, but have yet to fully explore Poveglia. Legend holds that a doctor who worked at the island's mental hospital tortured and killed patients before butchering them. While these claims remain unsubstantiated, the hospital's remains are still there, being slowly reclaimed by nature. Meanwhile, many paranormal enthusiasts believe Poveglia is haunted. But the island remains off-limits to visitors, and there is no word on if or when it will open up to the public. the Nazca Lines of Kazakhstan. You are probably already familiar with the Nazca Lines, but what a lot of people don't know is that across the entire globe, from South America to Central Asia, there is a group of giant geoglyphs almost exactly like the ones in Peru. These are the Kazakhstan geoglyphs, and over 50 of them have been discovered in northern Kazakhstan thanks to satellite images. Nobody is exactly sure what these geoglyphs mean, although some of the shapes have proved to be pretty disturbing. For example, researchers have identified a massive swastika scraped into the ground. It seems to be nearly 1,300 feet in diameter, and it's accompanied by plenty of other geometric shapes, things like crosses, rings, and squares. Some of these geoglyphs are bigger than modern aircraft carriers. The swastika pattern may sound bad, but it's not what you think. These symbols were actually used in ancient times as a symbol of peace and balance. It's also a little different than the one from the 30s. However, we're not really sure how old the symbols are here. They were definitely left behind by an ancient society, probably thousands of years ago, but nobody has come up with an exact date. We also don't know why they were made. The symbols could have been markers where rituals took place. They may have been used to mark ownership of the land. It's completely up in the air, and researchers are stumped. Aztec god's flesh. The use of psychedelic mushrooms can be traced back over 6,000 years. Some of the oldest surviving evidence of prehistoric people eating mushrooms to have a hallucinogenic experience is in Villar del Humo, Spain. That's where scientists have uncovered cave paintings displaying psychoactive mushrooms. In Spain, prehistoric humans munched on psilocybe hispanica, the only native Spanish mushroom known to get a person high. On the other side of the world, the Mesoamerican cultures feasted on something called psilocybe aztecorum, or the Aztec god's flesh mushrooms. It was the Aztec who had a particular hunger for these fascinating psychedelic shrooms. In fact, many historians believe that hallucinogenic substances played a massive part in Aztec religious life. And it wasn't only mushrooms. A research study by Bernardino de Sahagún identified 5 key substances the Aztecs used to keep themselves in a pretty constant state of intoxication, including the slime from the bufo toad. The bare truth is that the Aztec had a serious issue with hallucinogens. They used these kinds of substances during festivals, at celebrations, whenever an important person came over for a meeting. It was a major part of the culture and was used in all rituals involving divination, dream interpretation, prophecy, and even ordinary healing. If you went to see the doctor during the days of the Aztec, chances are the doctor was out of his mind on mushrooms. The buried city of Selinunte. Something happened 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece that you probably haven't been taught in history class. It was one of the greatest tragedies of ancient times, and it happened in what is now Sicily. Archaeologists recently dug up the buried city of Selinunte, where they say the local inhabitants were slaughtered, and whoever survived was taken as a slave by invaders from North Africa in the 5th century BC. Historians have known about what happened here for a long time, but it wasn't until recently that archaeologists were able to see the evidence with their own eyes. After the people of Selinunte were slaughtered or taken away, the city was largely abandoned. It then became buried over thousands of years as sand covered the buildings and they slowly sank into the earth. The city was once prosperous and flourishing. There was a nice harbor, an industrial zone, and residential neighborhoods. But that all changed when African troops from Carthage, what is now modern Tunisia, invaded the city and butchered 16,000 Greeks. The attack was unannounced, unprompted, and totally unnecessary. Women and children were cut down in the streets. An estimated 5,000 men were taken as slaves, with many thousands of women and children as well. One day the city was bustling and vibrant, and the next day it was a ghost town. The Prophet Daniel. The Prophecy of Daniel is a book in the Old Testament. And like anything having to do with the Bible, there is a great divide between what archaeologists say and what the religious believers say. But what happens when that line is blurred? To give you an example, scholars didn't think King David was a real person until 1993, when they discovered artifacts in Jerusalem proving beyond a doubt that King David lived and breathed. Theologians did not believe that Belshazzar was an actual figure, but just a character in the Bible. Daniel, in chapters 5, 7, and 8, mentions Belshazzar 8 times, and in the year 1854, archaeologists discovered 4 ancient cuneiform cylinders in Ur, the greatest city of Old Babylonia. These cylinders mentioned Belshazzar, son of King Nabonidus. No matter which side you're on, science or faith, archaeological evidence shows much of what was written in the prophecy of Daniel is non-fiction. Look at King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, between 605 BC and 562 BC. The Bible says he was driven away from men and ate grass like an ox, while his hair grew like feathers and his nails became birds' claws. Historians believe this part of the Bible can be explained by a weird psychological disease called boanthropy. It's when a person goes completely insane and acts like a cow, walking on all fours in a field and eating grass. It's a strange mental disorder allegedly brought on by dreams or hypnotism. The destruction of China's past. China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, began making power plays at the young age of 13 when he became the head of his state and had his mother's lover executed because he was a perceived threat to the young man's power. He ruled as the Qin dynasty's first emperor from 221 to 210 BC, during which time he got rid of any material that scholars might use to challenge his supremacy. Acting on the advice of his chief advisor Li Si, Qin Shi Huang is said to have ordered the destruction of nearly all previously existing books within the empire. The only exceptions were literary works on astrology, agriculture, medicine, divination, and the history of the Qin state. Anyone who was caught with certain ancient works, such as the Book of Songs or the Classic of History, faced brutal punishment. The year after the ban went into effect, Qin Shi Huang reportedly buried 460 scholars alive after they were caught with the forbidden books. Another account claims that the emperor had killed alchemists after they had fooled him into thinking they held the secret to eternal life. Either way, it's clear that Qin Shi Huang sought to destroy any historical records that failed to fall neatly in place with his narrative, and his mission succeeded, leaving modern historians with gaps in their quest to understand the past. The Pyramid of Argentina. Cono de Arita is the Great Pyramid of Argentina, depending on who you ask. This large sandy triangle is situated in the middle of an inhospitable wasteland, a place called Salar de Arizaro. The pyramid stands over 400 feet above the Sea of Salt. The only way to reach the pyramid is by descending through the high Andes, crossing the deadly salt flats, to reach the end of the world in this Patagonian landscape. The mystery with the pyramid is that nobody can say for sure if this was ever actually a real pyramid, or if it's just a natural geological formation. Scientists say it's nothing but a volcano sitting dormant on the salt flats. However, others say this was indeed a pyramid constructed by some kind of ancient civilization that lived in this part of Argentina thousands of years before the Inca ever ruled Peru in the north. And while there isn't actually any archaeological evidence to suggest an unknown race of people really did live here, it's not impossible. Even if Cono de Arita is nothing but a pyramid-shaped mound of sand, it still may have been the epicenter for ceremonial activities in the region. It's the most striking geological feature for thousands of miles in any direction. Any society who learned of its whereabouts would surely have made pilgrimages here to be closer to the gods. It's just that all traces of potential human activity have been wiped away by the desert sands and the thousands of years. And now for number 6, but first, it's shout-out time! Big thank you to Kaiser Soze and Jessica Tyree, who is a longtime subscriber. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. Hatshepsut's myrrh tree. There is a very mysterious tree in Egypt whose roots can apparently be traced back to one of the most famous queens in history. Her name is Hatshepsut, and if it had been up to one very bitter pharaoh, we wouldn't even know her name because she was nearly erased from the history books. After her stepson Thutmose III came into power following her death, he immediately began destroying all records and accounts of Hatshepsut's rule. Scholars believe it was revenge because Thutmose had wanted to inherit the throne from his father, but she had seized it instead and ruled for years. She had actually become one of the most respected rulers in ancient history, and so her stepson sourly tried to delete her from existence. But he failed, and today we know all about Hatshepsut's great accomplishments. However, there is one great thing Hatshepsut did that's a little more mysterious than the others. There is a myrrh tree at Hatshepsut's mortuary temple on the Nile. It's a withered old tree stump, somehow still standing despite being beaten by the Egyptian sun for thousands of years. It was put there 3,500 years ago, allegedly brought back from one of Hatshepsut's expeditions to the mysterious land of Punt. What's so mysterious is that nobody knows where the land of Punt actually is, or was. Some scholars believe it was Somalia, but that's never been confirmed. All we know is the Egyptians thought of Punt as a land of great intrigue, exotic delights, and magic. The ancient Egyptians thought of Punt the same way we think of the ancient Egyptians, and apparently Queen Hatshepsut brought this very tree back from the unknown exotic land. And, as if by magic, it is still standing in front of her temple all these years later. The Nephilim. In the book of Genesis, it is described how God created heaven and earth, how Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, and how Noah survived the great flood with a boat full of animals. It also tells about the fallen angels known as Nephilim. The book of Genesis claims that when these angels fell from heaven, they wandered the earth as giants. The entire story is in just 3 verses, and yet it has had such profound consequences throughout history. People have always wondered where these Nephilim may have gone if they really did walk the earth. And if they were real creatures, does that mean that giants actually existed? There's no possible way to answer this, but there is a piece of the story you may not have heard before. While the Nephilim in Genesis were only mentioned briefly and their purpose vague at best, Jewish writers really liked the idea. In the text we know as the Book of Enoch, likely written in the 2nd century AD, the story was improved. There was added a tale of 200 angels who plotted to steal the most beautiful wives from the humans. They were called the Watchers, and their desire for human women corrupted the world. After they stole the women, God cast them out of heaven and they became the Nephilim. They were evil and corrupted all of mankind, teaching women charms and enchantments and turning them into witches. They also taught the men how to use metal to create swords and knives for war. What started as just 3 lines in Genesis was escalated to an entirely different proportion in the Book of Enoch. The Knights Templar. On Christmas 1119, Baldwin II, King of Jerusalem, persuaded a group of French knights to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land. This was the formation of the Order of the Knights Templar. These knights lived like monks, took vows of chastity and poverty, and would protect peasants and civilians against enemies using violence. At least this was how they started. But just shy of 200 years later, in 1314, the Crusades were over. The church abolished the Templars, and they burned the Grand Master of the order at the stake in Paris. It was a miserable and fiery end for what is one of the most mysterious orders that ever existed. One thing you might not know is the connection between the Freemasons and the Knights Templar. Spoiler alert, there isn't one. Frank Sanello, a professional historian, explained in 2003 that Andrew Ramsay, a senior French Freemason of the 18th century, made up the link between the Freemasons and the Crusaders. He was the first one to claim that the Freemasons had descended from the order. It was all a trick to appeal to the French aristocracy to get more members. What's your favorite conspiracy theory involving the Knights Templar? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. The Lizard People. Apparently there are lizard people living underground in California. At least that's what the local legend and folklore of Los Angeles County says. The story of the lizard people underneath Los Angeles goes back 5,000 years to the ancient Hopi people. They claimed that a race of lizard people built 3 giant underground cities along the Pacific coast. One was beneath LA, and the locations of the others were unknown. The cities were apparently built as protection against terrible fires raging on the surface. The entirety of California found itself engulfed in fire, and so the lizard people retreated underground. But here's where the story gets confusing. According to the Hopi legend, these people weren't actually lizards as in reptilians. They were people who worshipped a lizard. This explains why they had such an affinity with building subterranean cities. Throughout the years, the interpretation of the story has changed dramatically. It went from a race of indigenous people who revered lizards to a literal race of lizard-human hybrids. Sadly, no underground city has ever actually been found. Mining engineer George Shufield searched for it in 1933 and apparently found a shaft that went 350 feet beneath the city, but he had to give up his efforts of locating the subterranean structures after a terrible cave-in. After he died in 1957, no one else went looking for them. Do you think there might be an ancient city under LA? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos coming up. Ovid's banned books. The Roman poet Ovid lived from 43 BC to 17 or 18 AD during the reign of Augustus. He was extremely popular yet controversial during his time, often focusing on erotic themes that Augustus found inappropriate and felt that the public needed protection from. Without consulting the Roman Senate, the emperor banished Ovid to the island of Tomis on the Black Sea. Augustus took particular offense to Ars Amatoria, or the Art of Love, a 3-book series that was meant as a guide to help men find and keep women, and to advise women on how to win and keep a man's love. Ovid's well-intending advice may have been interpreted by Augustus as a threat to the monogamous marital standards he encouraged among the population. His goal was to increase the Roman birth rate, but this was just the first of several times that Ovid's works would be banned from society. In 1497, during the burning of the Vanities, followers of the Dominican priest Girolamo Savonarola collected and burned tens of thousands of supposedly immoral objects in Florence, Italy. Included among them were all of Ovid's works, which were also burned in England in the bishop's ban of 1599. The poet's writing was even banned from being imported into the United States in 1928, when customs officials prohibited an English translation of Ars Amatoria from entering the country. The ban was lifted 2 years later owing to a legal exception that allowed books of literary or scientific merit that were otherwise considered immoral to be allowed into the United States. Persecuting weevils. In the 16th century, an insect was put on trial. In the year 1545, a group of winemakers from a small village in the Rhone Alps in France did something that's very hard to believe. They took some bugs to court. They placed a complaint through a legal representative that a species of weevil was destroying their vineyards. A weevil is a type of insect that you may have spotted in your flour or rice. Many of them have long snouts and they love to eat people's food. But they actually are not that harmful. Not that anyone knew that in the 16th century. The winemakers needed somebody to blame for the damage to their crops. Thankfully for the weevils, the court refused to pass any kind of sentence on them, and instead issued a proclamation the following year in 1546 that the winemakers say a public prayer. This was the theologically appropriate outcome to the trial, rather than hunting down and killing all the weevils. But the courts didn't finish up that quickly. They went and dragged the entire town into the situation. In order to serve some divine vengeance against the weevils, the entire town was ordered to repent for their sins, pay their tithes, celebrate 3 high masses, and then to march in solidarity around the vineyards as if the weevils were some sort of plague sent by God. After all, it was the townspeople's sins in the first place that led to this evil. The public was a little surprised at this judgment since they already considered themselves to be church-going citizens. Later on, the weevils were taken to trial again, and this time they were excommunicated in exchange for receiving a piece of land. It's unclear whether they accepted the deal. Why was the church taking these cases in the first place? It's hard to say. The Spear of Destiny. No other holy relic in the world goes by so many names. I'm talking about the Spear of Destiny, the Holy Lance, the Lance of Longinus, the Spear of Longinus, and even the Spear of Christ. These are all the names that were given to the lance that supposedly pierced Jesus' side as he was crucified on the cross. The lance is described in detail in the Gospel of John. Now, nobody can say for sure if the spear was real because nobody even knows if Jesus truly existed. However, the spear was allegedly rediscovered by Helena of Constantinople when she traveled to the Holy Land sometime around 300 AD. It became an important relic in the Middle Ages and played a significant role in several of the Crusaders' biggest battles. And then it vanished. Nobody knows where it is today, but there is a bizarre rumor that Adolf Hitler had an obsession with the spear and sent his own men to find it. It's also important to note that there are a lot of fakes out there. There is a holy lance held in a museum in Vienna that was supposedly wielded by the soldier Longinus. And then there's the story of Dr. Howard Buchner. The doctor says that the spear was sent to Antarctica with a whole bunch of other Nazi treasures after the end of World War II. Then, in the 1970s, those treasures were rediscovered by a secret Nazi society and are now being hidden in Europe. The bloodthirsty Carthaginians. Archaeologists have come across overwhelming evidence that the ancient civilization of Carthage, in what is now North Africa, practiced something atrocious. What's truly amazing about the discovery is that for decades, scholars have adamantly denied that the Carthaginians did this. And yet now, researchers from Oxford University have confirmed that parents in ancient Carthage sacrificed their own children as offerings to the gods. There are ancient accounts by the Romans and Greeks that say the Carthaginians killed their own children. It was just something people knew up until around the 1970s. That was when scholars argued against the theory, citing it as racist propaganda. They said it was something that Greeks and Romans said to slander the Carthaginians. But based on evidence found in cemeteries throughout Carthage, as well as Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta, it really did happen. When children were only a few weeks old, they were taken to these locations, called tofets, sacrificed, and then cremated. The evidence comes from the discovery of both animal sacrifices in the same area and the inscriptions above the slain infants that indicated the parents' prayers asking for blessings. And it was all so the parents could be blessed by the gods. The Hill of Torture. On a hilltop in Auriesville, New York, is the Hill of Torture. On this hill is something that most Americans have probably never heard of. There is a shrine dedicated to 3 American martyrs of the 17th century. They are a trio who shed their blood for Christ right on this very spot in the 1640s. They were actually missionaries trying to convert the Native Americans, who weren't really interested, and you can probably understand why. Invading their land, bringing disease, and insulting their religion. You get it. But these 3 died pretty awful deaths. These 3 martyrs have been trying to spread the word of Jesus to the New World. Father Isaac Jogues died from being hit in the head with a tomahawk. Ren Goupil and John Lalande had their fingernails ripped out and their teeth pulled one by one. Their torture was so heinous that the men went down in history as martyrs and were given their own holy hill in New York, the Picatrix. Originally written in Arabic during the 10th or 11th century, the Picatrix is the Latin name for a 400-page book about magic and astrology. Nobody knows who wrote it. Historian Ibn Khaldun attributed the book's authorship to an astronomer and mathematician named Maslama al-Majriti, but experts had since proven that this is unlikely based on passages in the Picatrix that are believed to date back to when al-Majriti was a young child. The book's origins have been traced to Moorish Spain, which encompassed the Muslim-ruled portion of the Iberian Peninsula when it was written. In 1256, King Alfonso X of Castile ordered the book to be translated into Latin, leading to its circulation throughout Europe from 1450 to 1600. As a result, the Picatrix had a profound influence on medieval and Renaissance magic, as well as philosophy and other scholarly disciplines. It was a controversial work, leading some who studied and praised it to avoid mentioning any parts of the book that seemed to run contrary to Christianity. But, as historian Avner Ben Zaken pointed out, the Picatrix resonated with several Renaissance thinkers who were unfriendly to the establishment. And at some point, both the Arabic and Latin versions of it fell into obscurity until their rediscovery in the early 20th century. The Picatrix was essential for turning natural magic into philosophy, converting a sorcerer into an experimentalist, and altering the practice of natural magic into an official education system. It encouraged the application that scholars shift their focus from tradition and dogma to the distant sources of natural magic. Buried alive. A terrifying revelation has been made thanks to some bizarre burials found in a group of Chinese tombs. These tombs date back 3,000 years and belong to a wealthy clan from the Shang dynasty. The complex of tombs was uncovered at the ancient city of Anyang in China's Henan province. There are ruins here from one of the first major cities that ever sprang up in China, called Yin. It was the capital from around 1600 BC until 1046 BC. But the real forbidden history comes from what's under the city, in the 24 extravagant graves that have just been excavated. The graves held the remains of warriors and war horses, humans and animals that appear to have been sacrificed at the funerals of their wealthy patrons. It seems like they may have been buried alive to accompany the richest dead people in society into the afterlife. Inside the tombs, there were war chariots, the remains of the horses that pulled them, and warriors dressed in fancy clothes. Some of the warriors were found wearing hats which had been decorated with strings of shells. The foreheads of the horses had been covered in gold veneer. Everything looked like it had been part of some great ceremony for the dead. According to Kong Deming, the director of the local Institute of Cultural Relics, this is a very rare discovery in the ancient city. The ritualistic killing of the servants and warriors shows just how incredibly powerful the masters were and how they lorded over society. Mysterious ancient tooth. There is some very strange science happening regarding our ancient ancestors. A tooth which once belonged to a young girl was discovered in a cave in the Southeast Asian country of Laos. The tooth is 164,000 years old, and it belonged to a human lineage scientists call the Denisovans. The only other evidence of this bizarre form of ancient humans has come from other caves in Siberia and China. Finding a tooth from the exact same type of mysterious humanoid in Laos shows that the Denisovans must have lived in a wide range of environments, conditions, and latitudes. They lived all the way from the tropical forests of Southeast Asia to the freezing cold of the Siberian tundra. But just who were these ancient people, so distantly related to us on our human family tree? The experts aren't entirely sure. What they do say is that about 700,000 years ago, modern humans separated from Neanderthals and Denisovans. And then, about 400,000 years ago, the Neanderthals and Denisovans diverged. Although for the next several 100,000 years, they continued to mate with humans. The truth is that scientists don't know a lot about them. All they found so far are 5 confirmed fossils, consisting of 3 teeth, 1 finger bone, and a single jawbone. The secret revelations of Jesus. In an ancient Egyptian trash dump, archaeologists found what they believe to be the secret revelations of Jesus. The document is a rare manuscript discovered amongst piles of ancient tax receipts and bills of sales for donkeys from the 5th century. It's actually a manuscript from the New Testament that never actually made it into the Bible, called the First Apocalypse of James. But it's not the only time a copy of this has been found. The only other version was found in the Nag Hammadi Library in Egypt back in 1945, buried in jars underneath the ground. The text was likely stashed there around the year 367, after the Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius, decided which 27 books would be put into the New Testament. This particular story was deemed too heretical to be put into the Bible. It's another great example of how the stories in the Great Book were chosen for inclusion or discarded by powerful people long ago. This story is considered a forbidden text because of the way it portrays Jesus. Whoever wrote it described Jesus as more of a normal human than a Messiah. It said in the text that Jesus taught people the world they were living in was a prison created by an evil god, as if they were living in some kind of terrible matrix. He said the world was guarded by demonic figures he called archons, and that the only way past these demons and into the afterlife was with special passwords. You can probably see why this story never made it into the official Bible. The Sinai lead plates. The Sinai lead plates are fake nonsense, or are some of the most priceless artifacts in the world. Experts can't quite figure it out. The lead plates were supposedly cast from the solid gold originals, with the inscriptions of an unknown language, a language made with the Greek alphabet and a few random unknown characters. They were discovered in a warehouse at the Bucharest Museum of Antiquities in Romania back in the 1800s. There were 200 pieces in the collection, and nobody has any idea where they came from. They just showed up there. Photos were taken proving that there were indeed 200 pieces, but only 35 are left today. When they were first found, professionals at the museum disregarded the plates as forgeries. They looked too new. They couldn't find any traces of erosion on the plates, and the gold originals were nowhere to be found. Still, these treasures were valuable enough to be removed in 1916 when World War I broke out. It wasn't until 2003 that interest was renewed in the mysterious artifacts. Some said the original gold copies had been kept at the Sinaia Monastery in Romania, then used to build Peles Castle. Nobody has ever deciphered the language on the plates. Plus, an analysis by the Institute of Atomic Physics concluded they were probably made from lead in the 19th century. And so, the mystery of the plates continues. Taliban totalitarianism. Afghanistan was uniquely located along ancient trade routes, historically serving as a connection between the East and the West. Traders from many parts of the world passed through, turning it into a culturally diverse center of commerce. And in recent decades, a lot of this history was preserved. That all changed when the Taliban rose to power, causing archaeological excavations to grind to a halt, and ultimately leading to the destruction of tens of thousands of ancient sites and artifacts. When the Taliban reconquered Afghanistan, archaeologists and museum curators scrambled to secure the historical sites and artifacts that they still had access to. They were worried that the extremely conservative Islamic fundamentalist group would go around destroying valuable history, much as they had in 2001. During this earlier round of destruction, Taliban founder Mullah Omar ordered his militants to destroy a pair of monumental sculptures known as the Buddhas of Bamiyan. Standing at 180 feet and 125 feet tall, his statues were carved into a cliffside 8,200 feet above sea level during the 6th and 7th centuries. Under Omar's strict religious views, they were considered idols, and these are just two of many landmarks and artifacts that received the same label and have been lost to history at the Taliban's hands. The group also destroyed nearly 2,800 statues and other works of art at the Kabul Museum, and some 55,000 literary works at the Pui Public Library, which housed some of the nation's most historically valuable texts. Some suspected that Omar ordered the destruction as retaliation against Western countries for imposing economic sanctions on Afghanistan, and that the acts had less to do with his beliefs than he claimed. Either way, these ancient treasures from what was once a major cultural crossroads are gone forever. Ignoring the Torah. A new study of ancient fish bones has proven that Judeans didn't always take the Torah quite as seriously as most people may have thought. In fact, Jewish people of ancient Israel may have completely ignored the Torah and ate non-kosher fish, even though it was prohibited. Researchers recently looked at fish bones found at 30 different archaeological sites across Israel and Sinai. These bones date back over 2,000 years and cover a period of time from the Late Bronze Age to the Byzantine period. The overwhelming evidence shows that Judeans ate pretty much all the fish they wanted, even though the Torah prohibited them from eating finless and scaleless fish. The issue here is that the Torah was written at a lot of different times. The writing of this text started way before the destruction of Jerusalem, probably around 586 BC, and writing continued all the way up until the more modern times of Hellenistic Greece. There are two passages which forbid eating any kind of species of fish that lacks scales or fins, but it never really says why. This rule probably came about because of something that was happening in society over 2,500 years ago, but has been lost to time. Archaeological evidence shows that Judeans continued to eat whatever kind of fish they wanted anyway, right up until the Roman era, when non-kosher fish bones suddenly became absent from all Judean settlements. Even though the rule was around for hundreds of years before, the Judeans never really bothered with it. Not until the Romans came around, and nobody has any idea why. Canaanite goddess. While cultivating some fields near the city of Khan Yunis near the Gaza Strip, a farmer came across an extraordinarily rare sculpture. The sculpture dates back 4,500 years. It's a stone head which had broken off of its body centuries ago. And while it's a little difficult to identify the face of the statue beyond any doubt, archaeologists believe it could very well be the Canaanite goddess Anat. Anat was the goddess of love, beauty, and also war in the mythology of the Canaanites. This is according to Jamal Abu Rida, the local ministry director, who said her statue was discovered with a snake crown, which was once the symbol of strength and invincibility for the Canaanites. It was the Canaanites who lived in the ancient territory of Canaan, what is today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. They are considered to be one of the oldest civilizations in human history. Anat was a truly remarkable goddess and was worshipped by everyone from the Canaanites to the Egyptians. This is something not a lot of people know. In ancient times, gods were basically like celebrities. The most popular would be passed around by word of mouth, They would become more popular in different cultures, and then you had deities like Anat and Zeus being worshipped across all of the Mediterranean. In fact, Anat became so popular that she morphed and turned into a whole bunch of different goddesses in the ancient world. She would even go on to become the goddess Athena in Greek mythology. The Greeks took Anat, moved some letters around, made her a goddess of wisdom, and that was that. Royal eunuchs. In imperial China, the emperor kept a huge harem of women. We already know that the ancient rulers of China had large groups of kept women at their disposal for both pleasure and procreation. But what a lot of people don't know is that there was a hierarchy inside every emperor's harem. The lady on top was the official wife, or the empress. Then there were the consorts, higher-ranking women but with no real power. The ones on the bottom were concubines. During the Ming Dynasty, between 1368 and 1644, every emperor held a ceremony in the Forbidden City, in which he would choose all his favorite girls aged between 14 and 16. These girls were basically slaves. And now we're getting to the part that may surprise you. The emperor also had a small army of eunuchs to take care of his hundreds and hundreds of female slaves. Because ordinary men were not allowed anywhere near them, the emperor would have thousands of servants be castrated so that they held no threat to his treasured consorts and concubines. They would live in the harem, taking care of everyone's needs. But that wasn't all of it. Concubines met a very tragic fate whenever the emperor died. He could have hundreds of them at any given time, but when he passed away, they were all rounded up and sacrificed, usually buried alive, so that they could pleasure the emperor in the afterlife. The treasure of the Yanganatis. The treasure of the Yanganatis is another bizarre trove of artifacts that may or may not be real. This treasure comprises massive amounts of gold, silver, and electrum, relics that are supposedly hidden deep in Ecuador in the Yanganatis mountain range. The Incan general Rumi Nahui put them there in the 16th century. To understand this better, we need to start at 1532 with Francisco Pizarro. He established the town of San Miguel de Piura and began his glorious conquest of the Inca Empire. He captured King Atahualpa at Cajamarca, and the king offered to give him vast amounts of gold for his life and freedom. Naturally, Francisco agreed. Things went wrong quickly. The Spaniard didn't trust the Inca king, and he had him killed in July 1533. But according to legend, his general, Rumi Nahui, had been on his way there with the gold for the ransom at the time of the king's death. When he learned of the treachery, he changed his course and hauled the treasure deep into the mountains. It's allegedly still there, somewhere hiding in a cave or at the bottom of a lake. William Tyndale's New Testament. Along with the printing press came increased literacy in societies where reading and writing were once reserved for the more privileged classes. Now that commoners had ready access to printed materials, they began learning these skills in large numbers. This proved troubling for some religious institutions, which felt threatened by the possibility of people reading and interpreting the Bible on their own. After all, up to that point, many, if not most worshippers, simply trusted that what the church told them was true, and that it was commanded by Scripture. In England, it was illegal to translate the Bible into English or any other common language, and people were also forbidden from owning these illegal translations. Getting caught with one could come with the death penalty. William Tyndale was a forward-thinking biblical scholar who knew that the times were changing. He asked the Bishop of London to revoke the ban on English translations and to sponsor the publication of an English New Testament. The bishop refused, but Tyndale mass-produced the book in secret. Many copies were smuggled into England and other places where the translation was unwelcome, sending authorities after Tyndale. He was arrested in Antwerp in 1535 and was held prisoner at a castle in Belgium until late the following year, when he was strangled and burned at the stake for his decision to make the Bible available to everyone. Tyndale's New Testament remains one of history's most influential literary works, despite the extremes that were taken to try and squash it out of existence. It even coined several phrases that many people use regularly without realizing where they originated, including the powers that be, eat, drink, and be merry, and fight the good fight. Jack the Giant Killer. The tale of Jack and the Beanstalk is significantly older than most people realize, and actually has ties to a legend of giants that may have lived thousands of years ago. The English fairy tale we're familiar with these days, the one with the giant that goes fee, fi, fo, fum, is an alteration of an 18th century story about Jack the Giant Killer. And the origins of that story can be traced through the oral histories of prehistoric England, way beyond modern times, to thousands of years ago when a race of giants allegedly occupied the British Isles. According to Raphael Holinshed, who wrote a 16th century chronicle of England, Scotland, and Ireland, Britain's oldest name on record is Albion. That name can be traced to a prehistoric king who ruled a race of giants over 5,000 years ago. It sounds strange, but it might be more rooted in reality than most people want to believe. Marco Polo wrote that he encountered giants when he traveled to Zanzibar. The Bible is filled with stories of Middle Eastern giants. The journalist Glenn D. Kittler allegedly encountered men who were 8 feet tall when he journeyed deep into the Congo in the 20th century. These kinds of accounts come from all over the world since the beginning of time. These giants may have actually come from a very distinct subspecies of Homo sapiens. This is based on a skeleton that was discovered in a Siberian cave over a decade ago. This skeleton, a unique kind of humanoid called a Denisovan, lived 50,000 years ago and was way taller than other man-like species. It's possible that the descendants of these extremely tall, primitive people could have wandered all the way into North America, then slowly went extinct. Stonehenge hunting pits. The mystery of Stonehenge just keeps getting stranger. Researchers have just discovered hunting pits dated at over 10,000 years old, made far before the actual stones were ever erected at this ancient monument. The find was made by archaeologists with the University of Birmingham. The pits are about 13 feet wide and over 6 feet deep, and were made by hunter-gatherers between 8,200 BC and 7,800 BC. This was during the Mesolithic period, just after the Ice Age came to an end. The first important thing to note is that the hunting pits have nothing to do with Stonehenge itself. Rather, it all has to do with this specific part of England. These are some of the oldest prehistoric pits that have ever been excavated, and it shows that people were continuously drawn to this area for about 7,000 years. From primitive people all the way to the Bronze Age, from living in caves to practicing agriculture. The mystery is that we still have no idea what drew human beings to Stonehenge. Even thousands of years before the first stones were put up, humans were digging holes all around the site. It's almost as if there is something in the soil here that drew ancient humans directly to this spot. Devil worship in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, serious witch hunts began. The Church launched the Inquisition, and women all throughout Europe were targeted as Satan worshippers and evil sorceresses. And while you are probably familiar with many of the atrocities committed by the Church to combat what they saw as the brides of the devil, there is one piece of history you might not know. Scholars believe the whole idea of devil worship may have been fabricated by the Church itself. After the disintegration of Rome and pagan ideology, Christianity swept across Europe, but it likely didn't penetrate some of the more rural areas for hundreds of years, where pagan religions continued unhindered. Plus, Christianity was typically practiced at the same time as many of the older religions. There were even hybrid religions such as dualism that mixed Christianity with the belief in more natural deities. Obviously, the Church didn't like this. It's been suggested that in order to have Christianity fully adopted by every last citizen in Europe, they created a common villain. To control pockets of people they viewed as heretics, and to maintain their control, they came up with devil worship. They accused people, hunted down people they said were involved, and through these efforts, paganism was completely abolished. The Church cemented their influence over the land, their influence lasting even today. The Meowing Nuns. There is a bizarre story about a case of mass hysteria which possessed a secluded convent of nuns in France during the Middle Ages. We don't have an exact year, but the nuns were apparently overcome with the desire to meow like cats. These nuns slowly went insane, meowing for hours at a time, and would only stop when soldiers beat and whipped them. Shortly after this original case, the same thing happened in Germany in the 15th century. This time, a group of nuns bit each other. News traveled through the region, and other nuns at other nunneries had the same problem. It was a biting epidemic, and it spread as far as Holland and Rome. This is a real thing that happened based on historical records all across Europe, and yet nobody knows why it happened. Reports from the 15th century say the nuns would continue to bite each other until they were exhausted. They meowed like cats, bit strangers, and it was all around very weird. It only stopped when religious leaders turned to the civil authorities to have the nuns flogged, dunked in barrels of water, and thrown in prison. Order was eventually restored, and there have been very few outbreaks of biting mania ever since. Nazi book burning. As the Nazi Party rose to power, an association of German university students created blacklists of political and literary works that they deemed to be un-German. The lists included books by Albert Einstein, Ernest Hemingway, renowned poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, novelist Erich Maria Remarque, and others who rank among history's most influential thinkers and creators. Many of them were Jewish. Starting on May 10, 1933, these student groups carried out a series of book burnings at universities throughout the country. In Berlin, Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels delivered a speech to a crowd of 40,000, proclaiming that Jewish intellectualism is dead. Thousands of books were lit ablaze at these gatherings while students marched in unity against the so-called un-German spirit. After the initial book burnings, the Nazis continued on their campaign to eliminate books by Jewish writers and others whom they viewed as a challenge to Hitler's extremist rhetoric from the public consciousness. The Germans burned millions of books in its occupied territories, including Poland, where 80% of the country's school libraries and 3/4 of its scientific libraries were destroyed. The Tuli Papyrus. The Tuli Papyrus is an ancient Egyptian document from the rule of Thutmose III. The ancient papyrus first gained notoriety in 1953 when Tiffany Thayer wrote of the artifact in Fortean Society magazine. The papyrus was supposedly discovered among the loose papers of a deceased Vatican museum director by the name of Alberto Tulli. Within the papyrus is the description of a UFO sighting from thousands of years ago. The document supposedly goes into great description about circles of fire and giant red discs that came out of the sky, but nobody knows if this document is actually real. This is one of the most controversial ancient Egyptian documents that's out there. The first issue is that nobody believes the translation. Pretty much all mainstream scientists have called this thing a hoax and pure nonsense. The papyrus almost definitely exists, it's just the translation that's controversial. But if it's true, as it very well could be, that makes the document the oldest known confirmation of an alien visitor to our planet. The secret Greek gods. Even in the days of ancient Greece, some knowledge and some beliefs were considered forbidden. While gods like Zeus and Poseidon may have been mainstream, there were other gods who were worshipped by a secret underground cult. These gods were called the Kabeidi. This mysterious cult was so secret that we still don't know much about it today. Historians believe the cultist activity was centered on the islands of Lemnos and Samothrace. However, the worship of the Kabeidi gods could have taken place outside of Greece as well. One of the most important places of worship for these discreet cult members was the Sanctuary of the Great Gods, or the Samothrace Temple Complex. It was built to the west of the city, just at the fringe of civilization. We don't know all the gods they worshipped, but we do know that they had a special place for the divine witch Hecate, the fertility goddess Demeter, and her daughter Persephone, and the sea divinities called daemones. Archaeological evidence suggests there were two main figures at the core of this cult, but nobody has ever been able to identify them. The Necronomicon. The Necronomicon is arguably the most nefarious book ever, but it never existed. This book was created by H.P. Lovecraft in his stories of cosmic terror. It then became even more famous when it was used in the Evil Dead movie to summon terrible demons. But fortunately for all of us, no such book has ever existed. But there are some forbidden texts from medieval Europe that were said to do the same things as the Necronomicon. For example, the Grand Grimoire is a book of black magic that's been dated back as far as 1421. Some scholars believe it was written in the 19th century as a hoax, but nobody really knows. It definitely couldn't have been published later than 1701. In any case, it contains ancient writings as old as King Solomon. Within the book are instructions on how to summon Lucifer, how to strike a deal with the devil, and how to bend lesser demons to do one's bidding. Unlike the Necronomicon, this is a very real book that you can use to try and summon demons. It's hopefully not going to work, but all the instructions are there anyway. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In Jerusalem, there are thousands of tiny medieval crosses carved into the walls of the holiest church in the world. It's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a sacred site allegedly built on the place where the Romans crucified Jesus. Religious scholars have chalked up the crosses to graffiti left behind by medieval pilgrims. A recent study of the crosses shows they were Masons. Researcher Amit Rehem analyzed every inch of each cross on the wall. He looked at the depth, the width, and the hand of the people who carved them. What he discovered is that the crosses were likely all carved by the same person, or by just one or two people. Why did they do this? The best guess archaeologists have is that pilgrims from all over Europe journeyed to the church and then paid a stonemason to carve a cross for them on the wall. They saved the dust created by the carving as a sacred keepsake. Pilgrims probably put the dust in a small lead flask, then took it home as their own piece of the Holy Land. And while the case of the crosses is mysterious, the church itself is the big mystery here. We know the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was built in the 4th century. According to legend, it was the mother of the great Roman Emperor Constantine, Saint Helena, who traveled to Jerusalem and discovered the exact spot where Jesus had been crucified, buried, and subsequently resurrected. Constantine then had the basilica built, which became the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In modern times, no proof has ever been discovered that this was the place where Jesus Christ came back to life. The Great Library of Alexandria. The burning of the Great Library at Alexandria in northern Egypt is one of history's best-known travesties. Founded in 283 BC, it was at one point the ancient world's largest library, housing over 100 full-time scholars and containing texts by renowned thinkers and writers like Homer, Plato, and Socrates. Even more impressively, it didn't admit visitors based on wealth, unlike other libraries of the time, but was open to anyone who proved to be a worthy scholar. Legend holds that the Great Library of Alexandria burned to the ground at some point, taking hundreds of thousands of valuable literary works with it. But evidence suggests that its decline was much more gradual than experts previously believed, and budget shortfalls played a major role in the library's downfall. The first alleged fire at the Alexandria Library occurred around 40 AD, when Julius Caesar and his invading forces set it on fire, marking the first in a series of destructive battles and blazes over the following centuries. Government spending cuts and other policy changes helped immensely with tipping the Great Library at Alexandria into non-existence. When Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius revoked resident scholars' pay and banned foreign scholars from visiting, he effectively closed the library down, leaving its precious contents neglected and forgotten. Religious riots further damaged the learning center in 391 and 415 AD, and the library met its ultimate end in the year 640, when it was captured by Arab forces, who reportedly gathered the remaining manuscripts and used them as fuel for thousands of bathhouses. Ancient secrets. When people wanted to pass secrets along in the olden days, they didn't have coded text messages and secret folders to hide their stuff. Instead, they used a very sneaky technique called letter locking to keep all their forbidden text hidden from prying eyes. Sending letters centuries ago was quite an affair. A piece of paper didn't go into an envelope and get dumped into a postal receptacle. Instead, they just used letter locking. This was the process of making extremely specific folds and cuts in a piece of paper so that it would seal itself shut. It was almost like medieval origami, something anyone could do to protect their darkest secrets. When a letter was sent that was locked together using its own folds and flaps, there was no way somebody could sneak a peek. Not unless they undid all the folds, which would leave obvious evidence of tampering. And back then, no mail delivery person would dare do such a thing because it would ruin their reputation, and they would never get work again. This earliest form of encryption probably began in the 1200s in Europe and continued to be used to keep documents, love letters, and death threats safe, up until it started falling out of favor in the 18th century. Thanks for watching! What's your favorite piece of weird history? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!